Welcome, weary traveler, to this hearthside portal through time. As the embers glow and shadows dance upon the walls, let me transport you to an age of iron and earth, the Middle Ages, where every sunrise demanded blood, sweat, and unyielding resilience from those who worked the land. But before we begin, whisper to me, where does this story find you? Are you nestled beneath woolen blankets as night's velvet curtain falls, your breathing slowing to the rhythm of my words? Or perhaps you're curled in an armchair, the weight of modern life momentarily lifted by these tales of a simpler yet harsher world? If these chronicles of forgotten lives soothe your spirit, consider this an invitation to wander deeper into history's hidden corridors. There's profound comfort in letting centuries-old struggles and triumphs lull you toward dreams, for their echoes still shape our world today. Now, close your eyes and envision with me a mist-kissed morning in a 14th century English village. The eastern horizon bleeds crimson and amber, painting the thatched roofs in fiery hues while frost clings stubbornly to the barley fields. Somewhere beyond the crooked fence posts, a rooster's defiant crow shreds the silence, nature's alarm clock for those granted no luxury of laziness. Gradually, the village groans to life. Ghostly plumes of hearth smoke spiral from cottage chimneys as calloused hands revive last night's dying coals. The aromas of burning applewood and damp earth mingle with the pungent musk of livestock. The dairy cow's impatient lowing for her milking stool, the contented snorts of swine nosing through yesterday's vegetable scraps. Then, cutting through the pastoral symphony, comes the blacksmith's hammer. Clang, clang, clang. Its metallic heartbeat announcing another day of forging plowshares, horseshoes, and the cruel tools of war. This was the visceral reality for medieval peasants, a world where survival depended on submitting to nature's whims and their lord's mercurial temper. Their existence formed the very fabric of feudalism, coarse, unyielding, and perpetually fraying at the edges. Imagine spending your entire life within a single smoky room, its dirt floor strewn with moldy rushes, the walls a patchwork of woven hazel rods smeared with a foul mortar of clay, animal dung, and straw. Your bed? A lice-ridden sack stuffed with last summer's wheat stalks. Your possessions? A wooden bowl, a rusted knife, and perhaps a treasured pewter spoon passed down through 3 generations of grime. Their diets would make modern nutritionists weep. A relentless cycle of coarse barley bread, so dense it could crack teeth, thin vegetable pottage seasoned with desperation, and the occasional miracle of a spotted apple or wrinkled turnip from their garden plot. Meat was a fairy tale reserved for Christmas or the death of a valuable plow ox. Even their ale, a necessity when creek water bubbled with dysentery, was weaker than modern beer, its alcohol content barely masking the sour aftertaste of fermented despair. Malnutrition stalked them like a winter wolf. Children with distended bellies played beside fields their skeletal arms couldn't hope to till. Women aged decades before 30, their spines permanently curved from hauling water and grinding grain. The lucky ones died in bed from sheer exhaustion. The rest fell to typhoid, tuberculosis, or the Black Death's indiscriminate scythe, a horror that could empty entire villages between sunrise and sunset. Yet still they persisted. Their lives moved to the relentless metronome of feudal obligation, up at dawn's first blush, breaking fast with stale bread crusts, then laboring until the sun drowned in the western woods. Men spent 14-hour days bent double behind lumbering oxen, their hands blistered from wooden plow handles. Women juggled childcare with back-breaking chores, shearing sheep, brewing ale, spinning wool by firelight long after the children's cries faded into sleep. Even toddlers contributed, their tiny fingers perfect for plucking weeds or scaring crows from newly sown fields. The feudal pyramid crushed them at its base. At the apex lounged kings and bishops. Below them, sword-wielding nobles extracting taxes and tributes. And at the very bottom, ankle-deep in mud and manure, the peasantry. Some were freemen, allowed to own a chicken or two and dream of buying their liberty. Most were villains, human property bound to their lord's estate, forbidden to marry or travel without permission, their children born into the same chains. But in this oppressive darkness, sparks of defiance flickered. Meet William Langland, plowman, poet, and quiet revolutionary. Born a peasant in the 1330s, he stole literacy like a starving man pockets breadcrumbs, absorbing scripture from parish priests between backbreaking labor. His epic poem Piers Plowman became a subversive masterpiece, its titular peasant hero exposing clerical corruption and aristocratic greed with biting satire. In one iconic passage, Piers laments, "No fat geese hang in my rafters, no bacon flavors my pot, just 2 moldy cheeses and a loaf as hard as my calluses. Yet mark my words, when the last trumpet sounds, God will judge nobles and peasants by the same measure." Copied by hand and passed through taverns and fields, Langland's words prove that even an illiterate plowman's son could challenge an empire with nothing but inked parchment and righteous fury. The shepherd's life was one of solitary resilience, a world away from the crowded misery of village hovels. While field workers toiled shoulder to shoulder under the overseer's watchful eye, the shepherd walked alone with only his flock for company across windswept hills and shadowed valleys. His was a calling that demanded more than brute strength. It required an almost mystical attunement to nature's subtle language. A skilled shepherd could read the clouds like parchment, predicting storms hours before they darkened the horizon. He knew which dewy meadow grasses would fatten his sheep and which wilted plants carried poison in their veins. The birth of each lamb became his personal triumph, his hands guiding breech deliveries with practiced ease where village midwives might falter. And when wolves came prowling under the bone-white moon, he stood as both sentinel and soldier, armed with nothing but a wooden crook and a sling, ready to die for his woolly charges. The loneliness could drive men mad. Weeks might pass without human contact beyond occasional nods to other shepherds at distant pasture borders. His bed was often nothing more than a hollow beneath a hawthorn tree, his roof the star-strewn sky. In summer, he led the flock to high alpine meadows where the air tasted like cold metal and the grass grew emerald green from melting snows. Come autumn, he faced the perilous journey back, narrow mountain paths slick with ice, the ever-present threat of a ewe losing footing and dragging half the flock down a scree-filled ravine. Yet within this isolation bloomed unexpected beauty. There was profound satisfaction in watching healthy lambs gambol through buttercups, knowing their wool would clothe families through winter. At dusk, when the flock settled and the world held its breath, the shepherd might hear a skylark's song or catch the silver flash of a trout in some hidden stream. Many found God in these moments. After all, didn't Christ himself speak of being the Good Shepherd? This spiritual kinship echoes through medieval carols like the Shepherd's Song, where humble herdsmen become the first witnesses to the Nativity. On yonder hill the shepherd stood, his cloak damp with morning dew, his horn and pipe and leather flask. His name was Jolly, brave and true. The carol recounts how angels split the night to proclaim salvation's birth, how these ragged men, society's outcasts, were chosen to kneel before the manger. For medieval peasants, this story carried radical hope. If God's Son arrived among livestock and laborers, perhaps their suffering had sacred meaning too. But not all shepherds were pious paragons. Some stole neighbors' sheep under cover of fog. Others neglected flocks to gamble with traveling merchants. Yet even these black sheep played vital roles. Their wool filled royal coffers, their mutton fed armies. A skilled shepherd could earn enough to buy a second cloak or even a pewter cup, small luxuries that set him apart from field slaves. So when you pull on a wool sweater or smooth linen sheets, remember the solitary figures who made such comforts possible. Picture them silhouetted against stormy skies, their songs keeping wolves in despair at bay through the long, star-chilled nights. Meanwhile, in the village's putrid underbelly, far worse fates awaited those assigned society's most reviled tasks. The Gong Farmer's existence made shepherding seem heavenly by comparison. Each morning, he descended into reeking darkness, his nose stuffed with mint leaves, a futile defense against the stench, to shovel human waste from overflowing cesspits. This was sanitation medieval style. wading through excrement up to the knees, heaving buckets of raw sewage onto carts bound for the fields. The ammonia burned his eyes. Diseases lurked in every splash. Dysentery and typhoid claimed many Gong farmers before 40, their corpses buried quickly without mourners. Even death offered no dignity. Their graves were dug outside consecrated ground, as if the church feared their very bones would pollute holy soil. Yet here too, humanity flickered in the darkness. Some Gong farmers developed gallows humor, joking about their work while sharing stolen apples with orphan children. One legendary figure, Old Tom of Norwich, reportedly saved a drowning boy from a cesspit, emerging covered in filth to the shocked silence of onlookers. When the local abbot gifted Tom a gold coin, the outcast burst into tears. No one had ever thanked him before. Such rare moments of kindness couldn't mask the brutal reality. While nobles feasted in torchlit halls, the Gong farmer ate his maggoty bread alone at the village edge, the stink clinging to him like a second skin. His existence served as a grim reminder. Feudalism needed its untouchables to function, even as it pretended they didn't exist. While shepherds contended with wolves and loneliness, another group of peasants faced different dangers beneath the forest canopy. The woodcutters of medieval England worked in a world of singing axes and splintering timber, where a single misjudgment could mean crushing death. Theirs was a life balanced between necessity and peril, providing the fuel that kept both peasant hearths and royal forges burning through the bitter winters. Each morning before dawn, the woodcutter shouldered his axe, its blade nicked from countless encounters with stubborn oak, and trudged into the whispering woods. The work demanded perfect synchronization of muscle and mind. A tree might weigh as much as 2 oxen, yet it had to be felled precisely between huts or fences. The woodcutter's calloused hands knew every trick. How to angle cuts so the giant leaned toward open ground, when to shout, "Timber!" to alert nearby workers, and crucially, how to leap clear when the trunk began its groaning descent. Accidents happened with gruesome regularity. A splintered branch, widowmaker in their grim parlance, could plunge like a spear from 40 feet above. Rotten trunks might collapse sideways without warning. Even seasoned veterans lost fingers to glancing axe blows or developed permanent stoops from hauling logs twice their weight. The lucky ones retired with arthritic hands. The unlucky were buried beneath the very trees they felled. Yet within this brutality existed an almost sacred craftsmanship. A master woodcutter could read growth rings like a scholar deciphering manuscripts, knowing which logs would split cleanly for firewood and which deserved carving into beams. Some specialized in coppicing, the art of harvesting young shoots to ensure perpetual growth, a living testament to medieval sustainability. Others supplied the shipwrights with mighty masts, or the carpenters with flawless heartwood for cathedral ceilings. Their work fueled industries beyond warmth. Charcoal burners, those shadowy figures who lived for months in smoky forest clearings, transformed their logs into the pure carbon needed for forges. Glassmakers and lime burners relied on their steady supply. Without woodcutters, the medieval world would have frozen in darkness, its swords unsharpened, its bread unbaked. But the forest held more than timber. For outcasts like Johanna, the legendary Goose Girl accused of witchcraft, its depths offered both sanctuary and peril. After her village turned against her, some tales claim she fled into the woods, surviving on mushrooms and stolen eggs. Children's stories describe her leading pursuers into bogs or summoning storms with her mysterious pipe. The truth? More tragic. Historical records from 14th century Bavaria mention a Joan the poultry tender tried for maleficium after a nobleman's son died, following her administration of herbal remedies. Whether witch or healer, Johanna's fate reflects medieval peasants' precarious position. Those who displayed unusual knowledge, whether of animal husbandry, herbal medicine, or even literacy, risked accusations of diabolism. A woman like Johanna, poor and unprotected, made an easy target when crops failed or children sickened. Meanwhile, in villages across Europe, another figure labored at society's margins, the ditch digger. While less reviled than Gong Farmers, these men spent their lives knee-deep in mud, carving out irrigation channels and defensive moats. Their tools were simple: a wooden shovel reinforced with iron bands, a pick for breaking stubborn roots. But their impact shaped landscapes. A well-dug ditch could mean the difference between fertile fields and swampy ruin. During wartime, their hastily excavated trenches often determined whether raiders breached village walls. Yet few thanked them for this vital work. The diggers developed their own slang and superstitions, like placing a rusty nail in each new ditch to ward off spirits. Some became minor folk heroes, like Longnet of Lincolnshire, said to have dug a mile-long drainage channel single-handedly during the Great Flood of 1322. The medieval peasant's world was thus one of invisible architects, shepherds preventing famine through their flocks, woodcutters enabling industry, ditch diggers defending communities. Their stories, etched in calluses and soil rather than parchment, form the forgotten foundation upon which kingdoms rose and fell. As you drift towards sleep, imagine their hands, cracked from labor, yet shaping history with every swing of axe or thrust of spade. The medieval countryside concealed another group of indispensable yet despised laborers, the peat cutters. While nobles feasted in their great halls and merchants grew fat from trade, these forgotten souls toiled knee-deep in freezing bogs, harvesting the compacted vegetation that would fuel peasant hearts through endless winters. Their work was a slow, grueling dance with the earth itself, each step potentially fatal on the unstable marshland. A skilled peat cutter moved with deliberate precision, his semicircular blade slicing through centuries of compressed plant matter. The peat came away in thick, brick-like slabs, dripping with icy water that numbed fingers within minutes. Workers developed a sixth sense for dangerous patches where the ground might suddenly give way, swallowing a man whole in the hungry muck. They spoke in hushed tones of bog lights, mysterious glowing vapors said to lure the unwary to their deaths. Yet within this watery purgatory, poetry sometimes blossomed. The legendary Peat wife Meg composed verses on strips of birch bark while resting between backbreaking labor. Her words, simple yet profound, captured the beauty hidden in this harsh existence. The iridescent dragonflies skimming tea-colored pools, the way morning mist transformed the bog into a spectral dreamscape. Few of her works survived, but those that did reveal a startling depth of observation from someone's society considered barely human. Cut slow, cut deep, the veteran peat workers would tell newcomers, else the winter cold cuts deeper. Their wisdom extended beyond mere survival tactics. These men and women understood the bog's secret rhythms, how to harvest sustainably so new peat would form, how certain mosses could staunch bleeding wounds, which berries could stave off scurvy during lean months. This hard-won knowledge meant the difference between life and death when famine stalked the land. Meanwhile, in the flickering torchlight of medieval mines, another class of laborers faced different horrors. The tin and coal miners spent their days in airless tunnels where the walls pressed close like a living thing. Children as young as 8 crawled through passages too narrow for adults, their small frames perfect for dragging or baskets. The constant danger of cave-ins meant many developed rituals for protection, touching a particular stone before each descent or whispering prayers to Saint Barbara, patron of miners. The contrast between these two worlds, the open, waterlogged bogs and the claustrophobic mines, highlighted feudalism's cruel paradox. Peasants endured such brutal conditions not for personal gain, but because their labor sustained the very system that oppressed them. The peat they cut warmed manor houses they'd never enter. The metals they mined became swords that enforced their servitude. Yet glimmers of resistance persisted. Miners developed secret whistling languages to communicate during revolts. Peat cutters deliberately lost portions of their harvest to sympathetic villagers. These small acts of defiance laid groundwork for larger uprisings, like the 1381 Peasants' Revolt led by the fiery Wat Tyler. Tyler himself had been a roof thatcher before becoming a revolutionary. another invisible trade crucial to medieval life. Thatchers spent their days perched atop rickety ladders, weaving river reeds into waterproof coverings that could last decades. It was delicate, dangerous work requiring perfect balance and an eye for patterns. The best thatchers could create elaborate designs, herringbone, diamond check, turning functional roofs into works of art. Like peat cutters and miners, thatchers possessed knowledge passed down through generations. They knew which reeds grew straightest near river bends, how to layer them for optimal rain runoff, even how to thatch symbols of protection into the ridges. This expertise gave them a quiet dignity, even as nobles dismissed them as straw stuffers. As night fell across the medieval landscape, these laborers, peat cutter, miner, thatcher, would return to identical hovels, their bodies aching from different torments but their dreams equally constrained. Yet in rare moments, perhaps while sharing a jug of watery ale, they might exchange stories that kindled something dangerous. The realization that without their calloused hands, the entire feudal edifice would crumble. The medieval harvest season transformed villages into frenzied hives of coordinated labor, where every able body, from wizened elders to children barely able to lift a sickle, joined the desperate race against time and weather. This was the peasants' most sacred and stressful period, when a single hailstorm could condemn an entire community to winter starvation. At dawn's first light, reapers fanned across golden fields, their curved blades flashing in rhythm. Seasoned workers moved with hypnotic efficiency, left hand grasping a wheat bundle, right swinging the sickle in a shallow arc, the stalks parting with a crisp whisper. They developed calluses in strange places, the inside of thumbs from constant friction, the right hip where the sickle handle rested during brief rests. Children followed behind, gathering fallen stalks too precious to waste, while older women bound the sheaves with practiced twists of straw. The heat was relentless. Sweat-stung, eyes already irritated by chaff and dust. Workers wrapped cloth around their faces, creating makeshift masks that turned gray with pollen by midday. Some developed harvest eyes, painful inflammations from grain particles, while others coughed up phlegm blackened by field dust. Yet they pushed forward, knowing the price of delay. Medieval records from Essex describe a particularly tragic year when rains arrived a week early, ruining 60% of the crop. That winter, villagers reportedly resorted to boiling tree bark for sustenance. Amidst this backbreaking work, harvest traditions offered fleeting relief. At midday, the Lord's steward might distribute weak beer, not from generosity, but because even beasts of burden need watering. Women passed around onion-stuffed bread while singers kept time with work songs. Cut them low, cut them clean. Stack them tight for winter's lean. God bless the roots still underground. Next year's hope when this is gleaned. The threshing that followed was equally grueling. Men swung flails, two wooden rods connected by leather, in perfect unison to separate grain from husks. The constant thwack 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 created a percussion that could be heard villages away, choking clouds of dust-filled barns, leaving workers coughing up golden phlegm for days afterward. Winnowing came next, where women tossed grain into the wind, letting breeze carry away the lighter chaff, a process requiring precise judgment of air currents. Yet within this collective suffering, moments of unexpected beauty flourished. The way morning dew turned spiderwebs between stalks into jeweled necklaces. The satisfaction of seeing barns gradually fill with grain. Even the tired laughter during harvest suppers, when communities briefly forgot their hardships through ale and storytelling. These agricultural rhythms birthed peculiar specialists. The reeve, a peasant foreman chosen for his literacy, kept meticulous tallies of sheaves owed to the Lord. His wax tablets recorded every bushel, creating the medieval equivalent of spreadsheets. Meanwhile, the miller operated his grinding stones with priest-like solemnity, knowing flour quality meant life or death. Villagers eyed him suspiciously. Millers were notoriously corrupt, but relied on his skills to transform hard grain into digestible flour. The harvest conclusion brought both relief and anxiety. While the first post-harvest meal, fresh bread, perhaps even meat, tasted sweeter than any noble's feast, everyone knew supplies must last until spring. Peasants developed sophisticated preservation methods, storing grain in elevated bins to deter rats, burying turnips in sand to prevent rot, even hanging cabbages upside down in icy streams as natural refrigeration. Children played a crucial role in this food security. Armed with sticks, they patrolled fields after harvest, chasing away birds desperate for leftover kernels. Some villages held gleaning races where children competed to collect the most fallen grain, both game and vital survival skill. The church officially sanctioned gleaning rights for the poor, though lords often ignored this doctrine. This delicate balance between abundance and famine shaped peasant psychology fundamentally. Even during relatively prosperous years, the medieval mind remained haunted by hunger's specter. Some historians argue this explains the vivid food imagery in peasant art and literature, the painted feasts on church walls, the lavish descriptions of meals and folktales. When physical sustenance was uncertain, imagination became its own nourishment. As autumn faded, villages turned to final preparations. Thatchers repaired roofs against coming storms. Blacksmiths worked overtime shoeing plow horses. Women brewed extra ale, not for merriment, but because fermentation killed waterborne pathogens. Every activity centered on one unshakable truth. Winter was coming, and only those who had truly earned their rest would survive to see spring's first green shoots. The onset of winter transformed peasant life into a desperate siege against the elements. As the first snowflakes dusted the thatched roofs, families huddled around sputtering hearths, their breath visible in the icy air. This was the season when the medieval peasants' true ingenuity shone through, not in grand inventions, but in countless small acts of defiance against starvation and frostbite. Within the cramped, smoky huts, every inch of space became multifunctional. The single room served as kitchen, bedroom, workshop, and barn. Chickens roost in rafters, their body heat adding precious warmth. Pigs sheltered by the doorway, their stench tolerated for the promise of emergency meat. Children slept head to toe in loft spaces, buried under mounds of patched blankets and straw-filled sacks. The fire was never allowed to die completely. Restarting it without modern matches could take hours of striking flint against steel while numb fingers fumbled. Women's winter work grew even more demanding. With no candles to spare, spinning and weaving happened by firelight, fingers moving from memory when darkness fell. The perpetual dampness made wool fibers cling stubbornly to the distaff. Some developed spinner's cough from breathing wool particles in the stagnant air. Yet they persevered, knowing spring would demand new clothes for fieldwork. Men turned to woodcraft during these frozen months. Using green wood that wouldn't split in the cold, they carved essential tools. New handles for plows, yokes for oxen, even wooden hinges for doors. The most skilled might fashion winter lights, hollowed turnips filled with animal fat, and a wick, providing 4 precious hours of dim illumination. These crafts weren't hobbies, but survival. A broken plow handle in spring could mean missing the planting window. Food preservation became a high art. Smoked hams hung from ceiling beams like grotesque chandeliers. Root vegetables buried in sand pits retained some crispness. Grains were stored in elevated wooden chests with cleverly designed lids to deter rats. Some families kept a live eel in their water barrel. The creature's constant movement prevented freezing while providing emergency protein if supplies ran dangerously low. Winter also brought unique social structures. With fieldwork impossible, villages turned inward. Storytellers became prized guests, their repertoires of folktales and gossip stretching through the long nights. Young men organized wolf watches, patrolling the perimeter armed with torches and crude spears, both to protect livestock and prove their courage to potential brides. Church authorities frowned upon the accompanying drinking and dice games, but even priests recognized these gatherings as necessary pressure valves. The cold reshaped bodies as much as routines. Chronic chilblains turned hands and feet into maps of swollen, itchy flesh. Winter teeth, painful cracks in enamel from alternating between frozen outdoor air and steaming pottage, became common. Respiratory illnesses ran rampant in the smoke-filled huts, with the cough, being so ubiquitous it barely warranted comment until blood appeared in the phlegm. Yet winter also offered rare moments of peasant agency. With lords holed up in their stone manors, village councils held unprecedented sway. Disputes over land boundaries or inheritance were settled not by noble decree, but through communal consensus. Some historians argue these winter gatherings planted early seeds of democratic thought, as peasants experienced brief periods of self-governance. The season's psychological toll was immense. The winter madness, we now recognize as seasonal affective disorder, drove some to desperate acts. Church records mention cases of peasants walking barefoot into blizzards or drowning themselves in half-frozen streams. More commonly, people simply withdrew, sitting motionless for hours while staring at the fire, a condition neighbors called wool gathering for its resemblance to absent-minded spinners. Religious observances helped maintain morale. Candlemas on February 2nd marked the symbolic midpoint of winter, when families brought their precious remaining candles to church for blessing. The sight of dozens of flickering lights in the nave offered hope that darkness wouldn't last forever. Even the pagan-rooted traditions like wassailing, orchards, singing to apple trees while pouring cider on their roots, served as vital reminders of life's cyclical nature. As the days gradually lengthened, new preparations began. Men repaired fishing nets for the spring runs. Women sorted seed grains, discarding anything moldy or insect-ridden. Children collected dung from thawing fields to mix with clay for hut repairs. Every activity carried renewed urgency, for the first thaw meant the relentless cycle of plowing, planting, and peasant toil would soon begin anew. Yet something subtle had changed during winter's captivity. The shared suffering forged bonds that persisted through the working year. The stories told by firelight became part of village identity. The hunger endured made spring's first greens taste all the sweeter. In surviving winter, medieval peasants proved their deepest truth. They were not merely victims of circumstance, but resourceful survivors whose quiet resilience would outlast any lord's decree or natural calamity. As the first green shoots pierced the thawing earth, medieval villages underwent their annual metamorphosis from survival mode to the frenetic activity of spring planting. This seasonal transition was no gentle awakening, but rather a desperate race against nature's unforgiving clock. Every day delayed meant smaller harvests come autumn. The peasant's entire year hinged on these crucial weeks of labor. The plowmen emerged as the undisputed masters of spring. Before dawn's light could gild the fields, they were already harnessing oxen to heavy wooden plows, their breath steaming in the crisp air. The best plowmen commanded respect bordering on reverence, for their ability to cut straight furrows determined the village's future. They walked with a distinctive rolling gait, legs permanently bowed from decades of pushing against stubborn soil. Their hands told the story of their trade, nails blackened from constant contact with earth, palms crisscrossed with scars where the plow handles had ripped flesh during sudden stops. Spring planting was a carefully choreographed ballet of desperation and hope. Following the plowmen came the sowers, their seed-filled pouches slung across stooped shoulders. They moved with rhythmic precision, 3 steps forward, a sweeping arm motion scattering grain, then 3 more steps. The perfect arc required years to master. Too wide and precious seed was wasted, too narrow and gaps invited weeds. Children trailed behind, clattering wooden noisemakers to scare off hungry birds, though some crafty rooks learned to ignore the racket, swooping in the moment small backs were turned. The weather was a capricious foe. A late frost could kill tender seedlings overnight. Heavy rains transformed fields into quagmires where seeds rotted before sprouting. In drought years, the topsoil blew away like brown snow, leaving peasants to plant in dust. Some villages developed rain-calling rituals, processing around fields while chanting psalms or, despite church disapproval, older incantations to fertility spirits. When the rains finally came, it wasn't uncommon to see grown men kneeling in the mud, letting the life-giving water soak through their threadbare tunics. Women's work intensified during planting season. Beyond their usual chores, they now prepared extra meals to sustain field workers. The planting porridge, a thick gruel fortified with last winter's dried herbs and the occasional scrap of salt pork, became the daily staple. They also managed the cottage gardens where vegetables, medicinal herbs, and dye plants grew. These small plots represented rare autonomy, as they were generally considered women's domain rather than part of the Lord's fields. Some developed sophisticated companion planting systems generations ahead of their time, like pairing onions with carrots to deter pests. The livestock demanded equal attention. Sheep heavy with winter wool were herded to washing streams, where strong-armed women scrubbed the filthy fleece until it gleamed white. The shearing that followed was a tense operation. One slip of the blade could mean a valuable animal bleeding to death. Meanwhile, cows fresh from winter barns produced milk rich with the first spring grasses, requiring constant churning into butter and cheese before it spoiled. Spring also marked the return of seasonal illnesses. Plowman's fever, likely a form of bacterial pneumonia, struck those who labored in cold rains. Children playing in newly thawed streams contracted water ague, probably giardiasis. Village healers, usually older women with knowledge of herbal remedies, worked tirelessly to combat these ailments using plants gathered during brief respites. Their physic gardens contained precursors to modern medicines: willow bark for pain, the original aspirin; poppy tears for sleep; even moldy bread applied to wounds in eerie anticipation of penicillin. The church calendar intertwined with agricultural rhythms. Rogation days in spring saw priests leading processions around field boundaries, blessing the crops while subtly reinforcing feudal hierarchies. More popular were the clandestine May Eve celebrations, when young couples slipped into the woods to bring in the May, a euphemism that scandalized clergy but reflected ancient fertility rites. These tensions between Christian doctrine and peasant pragmatism played out in villages across Europe. As the planting season reached its peak, an unspoken anxiety gripped the community. Had they sown enough? Had the timing been right? The answers wouldn't come until harvest, leaving months of uncertainty. Yet in this shared vulnerability, peasants found solidarity. Neighbors who quarreled all winter now worked side by side. Even the village idiot, often someone with what we now recognize as developmental disabilities, had a role, perhaps carrying water to field workers. The successful completion of planting was celebrated with subdued relief rather than exuberance. There might be an extra ration of ale, or the rare luxury of fresh meat if an aging sheep was slaughtered. But mostly, peasants collapsed into exhausted sleep, their bodies aching but their minds momentarily at peace. They'd done all humanly possible. Now fate and the elements would decide the rest. In these critical spring weeks, the medieval peasants' true mastery of their environment shone brightest. Without formal education, they maintained precise lunar calendars for planting different crops. Without thermometers, they read subtle signs in leaf buds and bird migrations. And without safety nets, they staked their family's survival on knowledge passed down through generations, one whispered lesson at a time, between the clang of the plow and the cry of the cuckoo marking spring's fleeting progress. The medieval summer unveiled a countryside transformed into a living tapestry of labor and survival. Fields that had been bare mud weeks earlier now rippled with young grain, while pastures grew thick with grass, nourishing livestock through the coming winter. But this apparent abundance masked the season's brutal realities. Summer was no idyllic respite, but rather a relentless gauntlet of maintenance, vigilance, and backbreaking preparation. Weeding became the peasant woman's eternal summer battle. Armed with nothing but a short-handled hoe and knee pads of stuffed leather, they moved through the rows in a permanent crouch. Their hands developed what villagers called thistle fingers, toughened pads resistant to prickles. The work was mind-numbingly repetitive yet required constant attention. Mistake a young barley shoot for grass, and next winter's bread supply diminished. Some women wove intricate reed hats with wide brims to ward off the hammering sun, their designs as unique as family tartans. Meanwhile, the hay harvest demanded every able body. Men swung scythes in great sweeping arcs, their blades kept razor-sharp with whetstones carried in belt pouches. The rhythm was everything. 3 steps, swing, 3 steps, swing. Done properly, the motion was almost meditative. Done poorly, it could slice open a foot. Behind the mowers came children and elders, turning the cut grass with wooden forks so it would dry evenly. The air filled with the sweet green scent of curing hay, a smell that still triggers deep nostalgia in regions preserving these traditions. Livestock required careful summer management. Shepherds led flocks to higher pastures where the grass remained lush, often living for weeks in rough shelters of woven branches. The famous shepherd's calendar, notches carved on staffs to track days, helped maintain some connection to village life below. Milk production peaked, requiring constant processing. Cheese-making became a round-the-clock operation in some households, with women taking turns stirring curds through the night. The blacksmith's forge became the village's beating heart during summer. Plowshares needed repairing after spring's hard use. New tools were forged for harvest, and horses required constant reshoeing. The smithy rang with a metallic symphony from dawn till dusk, its workers bare-chested under leather aprons, their skin permanently stained with soot and iron oxide. They were among the few peasants allowed minor privileges, perhaps an extra loaf at the manor's table, for their skills were too vital to risk losing. Summer also brought the peculiar phenomenon of moonlight acres. After completing their mandatory work on the Lord's domain, peasants would labor through the night on their own strips by the light of the waxing moon. The eerie sight of figures moving through silvered fields became the stuff of local legends, with some claiming these moonlit workers could never cast shadows. In reality, it was simply another example of peasant ingenuity, exploiting every possible moment to secure their family's survival. Water management grew critical as streams dwindled. Villagers cooperated to build intricate irrigation channels using hollowed logs, while children were posted as ditch guards to prevent water theft by neighboring communities. Disputes over fishing rights turned violent surprisingly often. Court records from Sussex mention a man gored by a rival's eel spear during an argument over a particularly productive stretch of river. The season also marked the height of medieval travel. Peddlers arrived with news from distant markets, their packs containing exotic luxuries like raisins or peppercorns for the rare household that could afford them. Pilgrims passed through on their way to shrines, sometimes bringing strange diseases in their wake. And always, lurking at the edge of summer's bustle, was the ever-present fear of mercenaries, unemployed soldiers who might turn to banditry when no wars were being fought. Yet summer offered its own small joys. The first wild strawberries glowing like rubies in the undergrowth. The rare indulgence of swimming in forbidden mill ponds, though the miller would chase them off with stones if caught. Women gathered flowers to weave into garlands for the midsummer festivities, when even the sternest priest turned a blind eye to the dancing and courtship rituals that harkened back to pagan times. As the season waned, an almost palpable tension gripped the village. The grain was turning from green to gold, the crucial transition that meant harvest would soon begin. Elders squinted at the sky each morning, sniffing the wind for hints of early storms. Fingers tested grain heads, judging their plumpness. The entire community stood poised like archers at full draw, waiting to release their accumulated energy into the most intense labor of the year. For the medieval peasant, summer was never truly about rest. It was the season of building reserves, not just of food, but of strength, skill, and communal bonds that would be tested to their limits when autumn scythes began their deadly dance through the golden fields. The medieval harvest season arrived not with celebration, but with a quiet intensity that gripped entire villages. As the first wheat heads began to droop under their golden weight, peasants entered a state of hyper-awareness. Every glance at the sky, every sniff of the wind carrying new urgency. This was their moment of reckoning, when a year's backbreaking labor would either be rewarded or lost to capricious weather or blight. Reapers moved through the fields like an army at dawn, their sickles flashing in synchronized arcs. Each worker developed a distinctive style, some preferring short, efficient chops while others used sweeping motions that covered more ground but wasted energy. The best could harvest an acre a day. Their blades kept honed to a murderous edge. They worked in staggered lines, the rhythmic swish-thud of cutting and bundling creating an almost musical cadence. Behind them followed the gleaners, typically widows and orphans, collecting every stray stalk as if each were a dropped coin. The physical toll was brutal. Hands became masses of blisters beneath cracked calluses. Straw particles embedded in sweaty skin caused angry rashes called harvest itch. Men collapsed from heat exhaustion, only to be revived with vinegar-soaked cloths and sent back to work. Yet there was an unspoken pride in these hardships. The depth of one's tan and the stiffness of one's movements became badges of honor at the harvest supper. Grain processing became a round-the-clock operation. Threshers worked in pairs, their flails rising and falling in alternating strokes to separate wheat from chaff on the hardened clay threshing floor. The constant thwack-thwack could be heard villages away, often continuing by torchlight deep into the night. Winnowing followed, women tossing grain into the air with wooden trays, their skirts billowing as they created artificial winds to carry away the lighter husks. It required precise judgment. Too vigorous a toss wasted good grain, too weak left impurities. The communal nature of harvest created unexpected social leveling. Lords knew better than to interfere during these crucial weeks, often retreating to their manors while peasants self-organized with military efficiency. Young men competed to outwork each other, their displays of strength sometimes earning them romantic attention. Elderly villagers who could no longer swing sickles took charge of guarding the precious grain stores against rats and thieves, a responsibility treated with near-religious solemnity. Food during harvest was unusually plentiful, yet barely tasted in the rush. Portable meals became an art form, bread loaves hollowed out and stuffed with bacon and beans, small ale flavored with harvest herbs to restore electrolytes, even early forms of energy bars made from pressed fruit and oats. Women developed ingenious ways to feed crowds, like the Sussex harvest pot, a massive stew continuously replenished throughout the day with whatever ingredients came to hand. The weather was a constant obsession. Dark clouds on the horizon could send entire villages into panic, everyone scrambling to protect cut grain before rain sprouted or ruined it. Some parishes kept rain saints, particularly effective statues or relics believed to influence precipitation. When storms threatened, these would be processed around fields while priests chanted psalms. The line between faith and desperation grew thin during harvest time. As the last sheaves were gathered, a collective exhaustion settled over the community. Yet there was no rest, only a shift to different labors. Fruit picking began in earnest, with children sent into the woods to gather nuts and berries. Bees were smoked out of their hives for precious honey. Livestock that couldn't be winter-fed was slaughtered in a grim festival of butchery, every scrap of meat, fat and offal carefully preserved. The harvest supper marked the season's official end, a rare moment of genuine celebration. Tables groaned under roasted meats, fresh bread, and the year's first apple cider. Songs were sung that hadn't been heard since last harvest, some bawdy, some mournful, all steeped in tradition. For one night, the strict feudal hierarchy softened slightly. The lord might make a token appearance, distributing alms to the poor in a display of noblesse oblige. But beneath the revelry lurked unspoken calculations. Had they gathered enough to last until spring? Would the lord's tithes leave sufficient surplus? These questions haunted every peasant family as they returned to their huts that night, their bodies aching but their storerooms, for the moment, full. The harvest moon bathed the stacked sheaves in eerie silver light, a beautiful yet ominous reminder that winter's gauntlet lay ahead. In those tense autumn nights, medieval peasants confronted their most profound truth. All their sweat and suffering had purchased not security, but merely a chance to survive long enough to begin the cycle anew. Yet still they celebrated, not because they were naive to life's cruelty, but precisely because they understood it so well. The harvest feast wasn't denial, it was defiance. As autumn's golden hues deepened into winter's skeletal grasp, medieval peasants entered their most philosophically complex season. The harvest was in, the slaughter completed, And now came the long months of darkness where survival depended as much on mental resilience as physical preparation. This was the time when peasant culture truly came alive in the flickering firelight, weaving together practicality and poetry in equal measure. The shortening days transformed peasant homes into multi-purpose sanctuaries. What had been mere sleeping spaces during warmer months now became workshops, schools, and social centers. Families huddled around central hearths, their activities radiating outward in concentric circles of necessity. Nearest the fire, tool mending and leatherworking where heat kept materials pliable. Next, spinning and sewing in the middle warmth. Furthest out, children practicing letters on wax tablets, or elders recounting stories too fragile to risk forgetting. The air hung thick with wood smoke and the pungent aroma of drying herbs strung from rafters, nature's pharmacy preserved against winter maladies. Women's work took on new urgency during these indoor months. The rhythmic scrape of flax being processed on wooden brakes filled the air as they transformed summer's plants into linen thread. This was skilled labor requiring exact pressure. Too forceful and fibers snapped, too gentle and the woody husks remained. The best spinners could produce thread so fine it vanished when held up to light, yet strong enough to outlast the wearer. Their hands moved ceaselessly, even during evening storytelling, the whir of spinning wheels providing constant accompaniment to winter tales. Men turned to crafts that required minimal light but maximized skill. Basket weaving became a winter art form, with intricate patterns distinguishing regional styles. Some villages specialized in particular items. The willow fish traps of East Anglia were traded as far as London. Others honed wood-carving skills, producing everything from wooden spoons to elaborate butter molds that imprinted decorative patterns on daily food. These weren't hobbies but vital barter items. A well-carved yoke might trade for enough salt to preserve next year's meat. Children's education became a communal effort during winter. While formal schooling remained rare, peasants developed ingenious methods to pass down knowledge. Herb identification became a game of smell and tell by firelight. Numbers were learned through tally sticks notched during imaginary sheep counting. Even morality lessons came wrapped in animal fables where clever hares outwitted wolves, subtle resistance training disguised as bedtime stories. The winter solstice brought peculiar mingling of traditions. Peasants dutifully attended Christmas Mass, then came home to older customs like the Yule log. An entire tree trunk burned continuously for 12 days to symbolically conquer darkness. Some kept witch bottles hidden in roof thatch, filled with nails and urine to repel evil spirits. The church frowned upon such practices but rarely intervened, recognizing their importance to peasant morale during the year's lowest ebb. Food preservation methods bordered on alchemy. Meat was packed and rendered fat inside ceramic jars, a primitive version of confit. Fruits fermented into alcoholic, sleeping juices that provided both preservation and winter comfort. Even mold was harnessed creatively. Certain cheeses were deliberately cultured with cave molds that would horrify modern health inspectors, but added vital calories and flavor to monotonous winter diets. Social bonds were tested and strengthened during confinement. Neighbors who feuded all summer now shared resources when blizzard struck. The elderly proved particularly valuable as living libraries of survival knowledge. Which roots could be boiled when stores ran low, how to distinguish fatal frostbite from treatable chilblains. In return, the community ensured they received warmest spots by the fire and first shares of scarce treats like honey or dried fruit. As winter wore on, subtle signs of preparation for spring began. Men secretly honed plowshares by firelight when others slept. Women sorted seed grains by quality, setting aside the plumpest kernels in special clay pots. These quiet acts of hope against the still deep snow demonstrated the peasants' defining trait, an ability to simultaneously live in the present's harsh realities while preparing for future possibilities. When the first tentative thaw finally came, it revealed not a broken people, but a tempered one. The medieval peasant emerged from winter's crucible with skills sharpened, stories replenished, and determination hardened. They had stared down hunger and boredom, transforming what could have been mere survival into a cultural repository that would sustain not just their bodies but their descendants for generations. In this way, the darkest season became ironically luminous, proving that human resilience could outshine even the dimmest winter sun.